Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this panel discussion entitled Getting the Zeitenwende Right, Military and Society in Modern Germany. This panel discussion is, in a sense, the Jim Mattis lecture. After he was awarded the Henry Kissinger Prize in 2021, the Academy established a Jim Mattis Fellowship named after the distinguished former Secretary of Defense and four-star general. And every year now we have a Jim Mattis Fellow. And this year's fellow is Mara Karlin, former Assistant Secretary of Defense. I want to say State, but that wouldn't have been right. Former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans and Operations, and capabilities.
All the good stuff.
Yeah. And also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary, a former Acting Assistant Secretary for International Security Assistance, and former Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Policy.
We try to make things as complicated as possible.
Hey, the Pentagon is what it is. So in addition to that, Mara is a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, and is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. So, and I'm supposed to mention that she was also a professor in the Semester at Sea program, which is one of the really great things out there. I wish I were doing it now, where you have a bunch of, is it high school or college students?
It's college students. It's 500 college students who live on a ship with faculty and staff.
And
for an entire semester.
And that is, it would qualify you to run for vice president, because we know that Tim Walz's formative experience was running the lunchroom. But anyway, it's great to have Mara here. She's one of the stars in the security establishment in Washington, and we're just delighted that she can make time for this. To my left is someone a little more familiar to you in all likelihood if you've turned on the TV in Germany in the last 20 years. Wolfgang Ischinger has been ambassador, the German ambassador of Washington, German ambassador to Her Majesty's Court, or the Court of St. James. He has also been Staatssekretär at the Foreign Office, and most recently, and perhaps best known, as the president of the Munich Security Council Foundation, correct? And he ran the Munich Security Council, Munich Security Conference for many years. So this is kind of an odd format for us. We have just finished about 8 hours of talking about various issues related to the Zeitenwende. It was a remarkable conference because there was an awful lot of passion around the table, a lot of really strong convictions about the importance of this moment, about the importance of the transatlantic tie, about the importance of rising to this particular occasion and the security challenges that it poses since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And for that reason, we really thought it was important to do an evaluation of the Zeitenwende and to think about where it should be going from here. And so I'm going to ask our panelists to try to both give their own views, but also perhaps represent some of the other views that were in the room at the time. And maybe I will start off with you, Wolfgang, give us the report card on the Zeitenwende from your perspective.
Okay. Okay. First of all, thank you for having me here. I think it's a privilege to be on this stage together with someone who has had all these distinguished positions in the Defense Department, and we're really delighted to have you here in Berlin. And I'm saying that as a member of the.
He's also a trustee. Yes, he's just done too many things. Pardon me.
So,
I think that's the end of my contract. Okay.
So on the report card issue, well, I'd say two things. First of all, I would give a straight A to Olaf Scholz for having made that famous historic speech 2.5 years ago at the end of February 22. I think it is remarkable that someone of his caliber took this decision without even informing his closest associates in the Bundestag, because he knew they would have questions about the 100 billion that he was announcing that day as an extra investment on German defense. So I would give him really a straight A for his vision and courage on that particular day. And it is, in retrospect, an important, a really important day in the way that we've tried to deal with the Russian challenge, with the Ukrainian war brought by Russia into Ukraine, etc. Now, I would give him only a barely passing grade, though, 0.2, when it comes to the follow-up. I think the problem is, as I see it, that too many people in this country, and I don't include anyone in this room, you're probably part of the enlightened part of the German electorate, but there are too many people around still, and there are even some within the German Bundestag who continue to believe that what Olaf Scholz announced then at the end of February 22, and what we have been able to do since in terms of financial, economic, political, and military support for Ukraine was actually defined as a kind of an act of charity for Ukraine. These are poor people who are suffering through a war, so we'll try to help them. Just like 50 years ago, we developed the idea of development aid, and we went to Africa and gave the poor African countries a little bit of support. I think that, of course, is a major deficiency of what happened. We should have, and I would actually argue the government, and I'm not blaming Olaf Scholz personally, of course, for this, but the government, the coalition, the spokespeople for the current coalition should have made it clearer to everybody in this country that this is not about charity. This is not a Benefizveranstaltung. This is about European security and the core elements of it. And if it's about core elements of European security, it is about us and the future of our country and our children and our European Union and actually our NATO. And I think that, if someone had asked me for advice after that famous speech, I think I would have said, do a kind of a follow-up speech every 3 months to tell our voters, the people who are eager to understand what's going on, tell them what has happened, how much money of these 100 billion is still left, and are we running out of funding as we do? And that would be the last point I want to make in terms of, after the straight A for the initial initiative, I think we need to, sadly, we need to acknowledge now that the 100 billion, as significant as it appeared at the time, fell far short of what was actually needed. Talk to any colonel or general or senior official in our defense department, and they will tell you that the 100 billion is great to have. It does cover a lot of areas that needed to be filled, but the 100 billion falls far short of what is actually needed to turn the German armed forces into a force that can actually do what it's supposed to do: defend our country and our partners. We're not there.
Yeah, so I think one of the shocks is that you actually don't get that many F-35 fighters for $100 billion. That is where we are in the defense world. So from an American perspective, Mara, and from all the things that you heard today, what is your view of the Zeitenwende?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it is such a treat to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Being on a panel with you, Wolfgang, is such an honor. This is a real treat. We had some very long and hard conversations today trying to assess the trajectory of this massive shift. And I do think it is worth us stepping back just for a moment and remembering where we were, say, 3 years ago. How different NATO looked 3 years ago, how different European security looked 3 years ago, even what the transatlantic alliance looked like. Strong, no doubt, but my goodness, has it solidified in extraordinary ways since then. So it's worth remembering where we started. I say that because I very much agree with and align myself with Wolfgang's tremendous analysis. For the German government to recognize this plastic moment. Now, this was, of course, very much helped by the spectacular, irresponsible, reckless invasion of President Putin of Ukraine. But nevertheless, it was recognized and a new vision was pulled together like this. That just does not usually happen, right? There's something really, really amazing about that. So he had the vision, the German government had the vision and put it out there. That's a hard thing to do. It turns out implementation is even harder. And I think that's exactly what we were hearing from Wolfgang as well. It turns out that actually getting this change into the oxygen of German society, of the German government, of the transatlantic relationship across Europe, that takes a lot of time, attention, and probably above all, resources.
Right. And Wolfgang, just to expand on your point, I mean, one of the things that we spoke about a lot is that, the 100 billion was great, and Germany has gotten to the point where it is meeting its NATO obligation of 2%. But in a couple of years, I mean, the 100 billion is all committed, and Germany will once again fall below the 2% mark, and that could be a real problem in terms of transatlantic relations.
It could be, indeed, it could be a problem in transatlantic relations. In our discussion earlier today, we did raise the unfortunate situation that from the perspective of many Americans, and I would include former President Donald Trump in this, we look, unfortunately, like cheap free riders. We've been told by a succession of former secretaries of defense. I remember Bob Gates, a very, very intellectual kind of secretary of defense, who in his valedictorian, in his goodbye speech, made the point, you Europeans, you need to take this seriously. We cannot forever, be the ones who pay for your security. Whether that's just a perception or whether it's a reality, it's a different problem. But that problem has existed. So that's part one of my answer. Part two is that the deficiencies in our defense setup have, of course, been continuing for well over 2, maybe 3 decades. I remember very well when I was a part of the speechwriting team in the early 90s, working for Helmut Kohl, working for first Hans-Dietrich Genscher, then his successor Klaus Kinkel. We were really delighted to put into these speeches the sentence, we're now only surrounded by friends. In other words, the end of history. The end of history. Why do we need a Bundeswehr? Why do we need Russia? Boris Yeltsin is our friend, right? Is there any problem left? Not really. A little later, we were asked, we were of course confronted with the post 9/11 situation, but that was practically a decade later, in 2001. Are we supposed to help America go to Afghanistan, which is what we did then? So there was a new reason why we would deploy troops. But we were, as a nation, as a society, in the 1990s, post-unification, engaged in what I would like to call a kind of a love affair with this new status quo, with this new situation, where everybody who surrounded us, all our neighbors were now our friends. There was no longer any Warsaw Pact. There were no longer any Soviet troops in East Germany. Everything was fine. And we underestimated over the following many years and decades that the world, unfortunately, is not only a world of well-meaning people. And we've now had to find out the hard way that we have to go back and re-equip our armed forces, along with our partners, try to build up at least in the conventional, in the non-nuclear field where we can do things, the kind of contribution to deterrence that we can present. And we are, I repeat myself, we are still far from being where we should be. And I quote our own defense minister. I'm a fan of Boris Pistorius, that he spoke freely and publicly about the fact that our armed forces are currently not in a position to defend this country. If some serious challenge were to happen, not in Ukraine, but here within the European Union or within NATO territory.
Right. So, Mara, I'm sure that you were aware of the kind of peculiarities of the relationship between army and state, or army and society in particular, in Germany. But this was in the post World War II period. But this was the subject of an awful lot of our discussion today, and I'm interested to know what you feel like you learned from that conversation.
Absolutely. And maybe I would just quickly key off of 2 points that Wolfgang mentioned. So one is, in terms of 2%, it is worth noting that almost 75% of NATO members are spending 2% now. It was maybe a third of that 3 years ago. So thank you again, President Putin, for that sort of inspiration, if you will. Yeah. But we spent years and years talking about it, and for many, it became a reality. So can that be sustained? And is that enough? Is probably the next conversation that needs to happen. I'm also struck by a comment Wolfgang made that came up a bunch today, which is the German experience in Afghanistan and what those lessons were of what went well. So, for example, getting experience, the experience of the deployment, of course, working through in a coalition, what did things like caveats look like, legal changes, and then maybe the things that were a little bit tougher. Trying to understand what does it look like to have losses in that conflict, and what does it look like to memorialize those there. Hitting your good point, Dan, and your question, we spent a lot of time talking about the relationship of German society to its military, obviously a unique one. And I think inevitably we couldn't help but try to throw analogies on, recognizing those analogies are imperfect. A couple things that jumped out. One was some polling that we talked about that actually shows there's overwhelming support by the German public of the military. It was more than 85%. That is nearly twice as much as we have in the United States. So it was striking. And what I found a little bit in the conversation was, as we were talking through the polling, of which apparently there's a good deal of polls that are saying this, just how uncertain a lot of folks were about that reality. I think it felt a little bit disconnected with what they had personally experienced. So I'm left wondering, why is that? What is that? What is so different there? As we think about this relationship between the society and the military, it's probably worth wondering, what is it that the military needs from society? Does it need money? Does it need the society to have knowledge of the military and what it does? Does it need people to join the military? And does it need folks to really support what it is all doing, right? So money, knowledge, support, recruitment. Those are kind of the key ones that probably come to mind. And I'm guessing the answer most of you all would have is yes to all of the above in different ways. But look, we're 2.5 years or so past the big change and the big announcement. How much progress has really been made on each of these? To what extent do you see the German military in public? How are perceptions of them changing? Polling notwithstanding. So that was pretty striking. In the U.S., we have a lot of data showing that there's broad support, but very limited knowledge of the military and what it does. And I've been thinking a little bit about, so what does that look like here, and what are those necessary ingredients here?
Well, I think that the coupling of support and knowledge is probably pretty similar here. I think that it's not the case that your average citizen has a deep knowledge unless they actually have a family member in the Bundeswehr. So we spent a lot of time interrogating those numbers, and Wolfgang, I'm gonna put to you the same question I put to you behind closed doors, which is, if you saw those poll numbers and you were a political consultant, you would say, seize on this issue. My God, think of the hay that is to be made. That does not seem to be the case in Germany, and I'm curious, as someone with a long career around the political elites, what is going on? They don't see the world that way.
I have to admit, I was surprised by these numbers myself. Yeah. Very positive polling results, as you said, in terms of support of the Bundeswehr, support of the armed forces. Well, I hope that is not only true for right now. I hope that support remains high. Why are political leaders in our political parties not trying to take more credit for this, build on it? That's your question. I guess part of the answer, and I'm not sure myself of how correct my answer is, but I think part of the answer is that the party elites in some of the parties that are currently part of our current coalition don't share that same conviction about, how great it is to have a decent army and a good Bundeswehr. I think there is a lot of doubt. There is a lot of undercurrent of pacifism, classic pacifism. Pacifism is in principle not bad. I don't blame people for being pacifist, but in the current situation, pacifism strikes me as quite far away from realism. If we want to deal with the real world, we need to acknowledge there is a war going on. I was recently, for the 4th or 5th time since February of 22 in Kiev, and I had a chance to talk to soldiers and to senior commanders. And when you talk to these people, or when they talk to you, you find that we seem to be living in an artificial world. These soldiers had great difficulty understanding when I try to explain to them the debate that we're having in this country, that we're having in Washington, D.C. Should we allow Ukraine to hit an airfield in Russia from which, Russians attack a hospital in Kiev or something like that? Of course, the Ukrainian soldiers that I was able to talk to, some of them were in Kiev because they had been injured. They were on exiting from the hospital, etc. For them, this is an unreal debate that we're having. They fight not only for their own lives, they fight for their families. They believe that if we lose another, stretch of land, it simply means that another million or so, or 5 million of Ukrainians will live under occupation. And so this is really quite desperate. And I think that many of our citizens here who have not had the chance that I've enjoyed to go there and to experience the reality of the situation in Ukraine, they think about this as a theoretical issue, and they believe that their classic pacifism, which was of course an outgrowth of the kind of Germany that governed in the first half of the 20th century. And pacifism was initially, I'm sure, a very decent way of dealing with the horrors that this country has perpetrated, before 1945. But we need to move into this century, and we need to move into the reality. And I think there is, if my observation is correct, the voters are closer to reality, according to these polls, than some of the elite political decision makers in our local or even in our federal parliament.
Just to come back to the cultural dimensions, though, and we are trying to sort through an enormous amount of different, often contradictory information. Someone in the group mentioned, I don't remember if it was you, Wolfgang, that when the Ukrainians would talk about their fallen soldiers or their wounded soldiers, they would talk about them as our heroes. Yeah. And Germans find it difficult, if not impossible, to use that kind of terminology about people engaged in warfare.
I think that der Held, the hero, is not a word that most of you would use in describing Bundeswehr soldiers today. It's just not in use. Yeah. For every single Ukrainian that I've met, that's the way they talk about the soldiers, and I think they, for good reasons, because these are heroes. They sacrifice their health, their lives. Too many of them, actually. So this is a real problem.
And it does, in light of the polling numbers we saw, and in light of what those of us who are following the war have seen, it begs a question about whether leaders, not just in Germany, but in the U.S. and Germany and across the West and all the countries that are supporting Ukraine, have to some extent fallen down on the job in terms of the necessity of continually making the case for the support. Mm-hmm. Now, it's politically quite challenging. I mean, in the U.S., as in Germany, the support for the funding has diminished significantly. It's become a political football in the context of the presidential election. And I guess we are confronted with the question of, can it be helped? Do people get tired? Is there compassion fatigue? Or is this really something that our political leaders should be doing?
Mm-hmm. So in rewinding history for a moment, I do think it is useful for us to remember where we were 2.5 years ago, right? When we were sitting here in February 2022, there was a question of for how many hours, for how many days would Ukraine continue to exist as a sovereign country? Right? That's where we were. And thanks to the tremendous heroism of Ukraine and to the support of 50 plus countries around the world, and I should note the most supportive in Europe, of course, is Germany. Ukraine has been able to get the assistance that it needed over these last 2.5 years. So it very much does still exist, indeed, as a country, right? Where it's a totally different conversation. So it's worth remembering that as we then kind of fast forward as time has passed, as I think folks are asking good questions. Now what? Where does this go? What does this look like? What does it look like to support Ukraine? I think Wolfgang had alluded to these very serious debates that have occurred on escalation. These are probably the most intense debates that we have had on escalation in 4+ decades. And that's pretty meaningful. I know in the United States, we've felt that quite profoundly. I assume that you all in Europe have as well. In really trying to understand, I mean, we've watched President Putin occasionally kind of rattle his nuclear sabers, and that is downright terrifying. And so trying to understand how exactly we work around that and help folks really think through what are the next steps in this conflict and how do we understand it. I guess what I'm thinking a little bit about here is how to help our society, your society, understand the urgency of the challenge posed by Russia, of the threat posed by Russia, that it's one that's actually not going away, although we can assume it will shapeshift a bit, and to remember and recognize that we actually have agency to shape it, right? We have agency. The Ukrainians have agency as well to try to influence what happens and how this comes together. And, the sort of old refrain in government is not making a decision, is making a decision. And I would just underscore that as we try to understand the agency we all have in trying to be supportive or not of Ukraine, in trying to underscore the serious threat that Russia poses.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of what Mara just said, but let me add the following thought, because I think this is something that comes up again and again in our German debate. We have political leaders, and you know whom I'm talking about, who will argue, if they were sitting here, they will argue, all we need to do is go for a ceasefire, and then the war will end, and all this killing will end, etc. Well, that is a very, very cheap proposition, because, of course, it's true, by stopping our support, American support, European support for Ukraine, sure, we could end this war probably tomorrow. But that would mean that you end a war by allowing Russia to win and forcing Ukraine to lose. And then, of course, the question arises, what will that do in the minds of all these players, including the folks in the Kremlin, in terms of what next? In other words, would that kind of ceasefire be a prequel, a first step toward lasting peace? I doubt it very, very much, which is why I think we tend to agree across the Atlantic that if we want to be smart about this, we should try to figure out a way to create in the minds of the decision makers in the Kremlin the awareness, which does not exist, I would imagine, at this moment, the awareness that the continued further use of the Russian military power will neither bring about Russian victory, nor will it bring about further major territorial gains. Of course, maybe 5 kilometers here, maybe another village there, but that is not a significant change of the overall landscape. If we can bring about, by continuing to support Ukraine, if we can bring about the growing awareness in Moscow that they've reached the end of the line, and maybe it's a better idea at some point to actually go to a negotiating table, then we're in better shape, and the Ukrainians will be in better shape, and Europe and the transatlantic relationship and NATO will be in much better shape. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely. Can I add one point? I would just add, it's worth remembering, if you reread the Zeitenwende speech, this is not just a story of Russia, right? Other authoritarian states are mentioned. They're not mentioned specifically, but it's an important reminder that what happens between Russia and Ukraine, between so much of the world and Russia, is being watched in places like Beijing. Right? Places like Beijing, where they're astonished that 50 plus countries can come together, be so generous with military support, be so generous with hosting refugees and trying to help Ukraine stand up. And they're wondering, will this last? What will this look like, et cetera? And so there are some who kind of make the case, no, it's all about, this challenger in Moscow, or it's all about this challenger in Beijing or Tehran or what have you. And I would say the answer is actually yes, all of the above. Each one is watching. We are inconveniently in a world in which there's a lot of challenge happening between democracies and dictatorships. And it requires, I think, an urgent approach so that the world can move more towards one direction and not towards the other.
Okay. Well, one of the subjects that we spent, or a clutch of subjects that we spent a lot of time on, could be summarized with the phrase that was heard around the table. And I should elaborate and say we had military officials, we had from both the United States and from Germany, we had academics, we had journalists. One of the phrases that was heard, I'm probably going to mangle it, was something like, we're in wartime and we have peacetime procurement, we have peacetime bureaucracy, and that is, on the one hand, not surprising because we are formally at peace, but on the other hand, deeply dispiriting because this is obviously a moment of enormous challenge. It's a moment of challenge for the Ukrainians who need the newest technology, most effective technology we can get them. Ukraine is truly a laboratory of innovation now, and therefore, if we want to help, people preserve their freedom, we need to not hesitate and get them the newest stuff. But at the same time, my God, we've been hearing the same stories about procurement either at Verteidigungsministerium or at the Pentagon, for decades. Mm-hmm. Is this a soluble problem?
I think we all need to believe it is solvable because it sure is an important one.
It's a very Kantian kind of approach. We have to believe in freedom, believe in fixing procurement.
Yeah. I'm a Midwesterner at heart back in the U.S. And believe with enough elbow grease, anything is possible. I mean, look, inside the U.S., we've had our own challenges here, as you are alluding to. I mean, the last time we had on-time defense appropriation, so the money to be able to spend on our military, the last time we had it was maybe something like 13 or so years ago. So all of this wasted time that inevitably happens, that's lost, where you can't actually start new programs. So there have been a number of efforts to try to go around the system. And that can be useful in some ways, but it invariably has its limitations, no doubt. And some of that involves being comfortable working with different types of companies, not just necessarily the sort of traditional defense companies and defense contractors. I do think some of this gets tied to this narrative. And I think that narrative is relevant in the United States, and it's relevant while we're sitting here as well, where folks understand what is it that we need our militaries to do? What is it that their mission should be? How do we fund them appropriately to be able to actually fulfill that mission and to do so with excellence? So we can keep finding ways to sort of paint over and slightly adjust and slightly tweak our different authorities and kind of other ways to go around the system. But the system itself fundamentally does need some reshaping to enable this change in a responsible way.
Yeah. Anything you want to add on the joyous subject of procurement?
Absolutely. I think that in a way we have collectively in Europe, and I know more about the European situation than about the situation in the United States in this matter. We've missed the boat. Of course, we should have, now in hindsight, we should have started in a much more determined manner 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. We should have, as our government should have started to prioritize long-term defense arrangements. I understand very well that our defense contractors will say to the government, I am going to build a new plant for your 155 millimeter artillery shells, but only if I know that, first of all, I'm going to be able to sell that thing to you and that you have the budgetary allowance to pay for it. Otherwise, I'm going to be sitting in all of this stuff. I will build a plant here or in one of our partner countries, and I'm responsible to my shareholders. So I think which is why I say we've missed the boat. We have tended to think as Europeans collectively that we can just continue our kind of peacetime, slow process. I was a couple of years ago, before the invasion, I was invited to see the plant that Rheinmetall has in Lower Saxony, where they built not the Leopard tank, but they built cannon and any number of equipment. The way they have done that in the past is they build 1 or 2 of these vehicles per day. It's like a Manufakturbetrieb, if you know what I'm talking about. It's very slow. It's 1 or 2 because there was no greater demand. Now, of course, they are confronted with the demand of having like 30 of these vehicles come off the band, the production line.
Production line.
Every day. So this requires huge investment and long-term planning, and our governments have not, in my view, not sufficiently supported this transformation from our classic "we're only surrounded by friends" philosophy of the last 3 decades into a situation where we don't consider ourselves to be at war, but we are supporting a country that is at war and is fighting for its very existence. That's where we are.
Yet the progress and the profound change that has happened in the energy sector is nothing short of astonishing, right? The willingness and the ability, which had to be terribly painful, to pull away from Russia on that front. As you'll recall, it was a piece of the Zeitenwende speech as well, saying we're going to do this, and that's largely happened.
Yes, but we have to give credit where it's due. The Norwegians built the gas terminals, and they did an amazing job in no time.
But that's, by the way, that's also one reason why an increasing number of companies are now investing in the US or in Canada, because energy there has tended to be cheaper. So this is sort of the secondary effect of this. We are suffering as a country. We're suffering. We continue to suffer quite a bit economically from the fact that we were so outrageously dependent on this Russian gas supply.
So one of the other things that we discovered in our conversations was that there are a tremendous number of really talented innovators out there with startups and all kinds of whiz-bang technology, but that to get it approved and scaled up in time, I think, and this is true in both of our countries, is an enormous challenge and is highly discouraging to many of the people who really do want to make a contribution. So I'm going to ask one last question and then open it to the audience. So there was one question that I think everyone felt deeply uncomfortable hazarding an answer about. And my wife uses the expression throwing a dead cat on the table. And the question, sorry, Henrika. The question was, so what does happen to this effort, and what happens to our alliance if Trump is elected? And, we had very thoughtful and scholarly and intelligent people around the table who were all looking at their shoes and not wanting to, try to do what the historians tell you not to do, which is predict the future. Anyway, what are you thinking, and what did you take away from it? Let's just give the additional background that Donald Trump doesn't really like Europe very much, and he's not a big fan of NATO, and he thinks all of our European partners are freeloaders, even though now 2/3 are paying their 2%. And he espouses the Putin line when it comes to who's at fault in Ukraine.
That is indeed a dead cat. So I guess I would answer this by thinking a little bit about geometries. What are the different types of cohorts that can come together across Europe to try to continue to fulfill the vision of a free, democratic Europe? Because you could potentially see the bumps that you are highlighting, Dan. And so what do those kind of mini laterals or geometries look like, right? And there are some that exist. There's the obvious big one, of course, which is NATO, which includes the United States. There's also a lot that the Europeans can do on their own. There's the Bucharest Nine. There's the Brits, the French, and the Germans coming together. There's the Balts. There's the Nords. There's all of these different cohorts. And I guess I wonder a little bit about, A, are those the right cohorts? Do you need some others? And then B, given where we're sitting, what role does Germany play with those? Does it offer thought leadership? Does it offer kind of meaningful investment to facilitate those? What does it look like for Germany to partner with some of those countries? Because I think there is a desire by a lot of countries to continue to see more of Germany, right? That Zeitenwende speech was heralded, right? Someone described it today as right after it was delivered, every time they saw a German, they started hugging them, right? It was really just heralded in so many different capitals. And then I guess there's a question of, so does Germany want to do any of those things, right? Does it want to play that role working with others? Does it want to be that thought leader? Does it want to be that action leader as well? Or maybe it just wants someone else in Europe perhaps to do those things?
The dead cat is yours.
Well, I share everything you said, Mara, but it's of course also true that for people who want to get reelected in this country, we have a federal election coming up, if not earlier, we don't know, but in a year's time or so. It is probably not particularly encouraging for many who are going to run for re-election to see what happened recently in the elections in the Eastern Länder, where those who advocate against continued support for Ukraine got a lot of the vote, a lot more than I would have imagined, actually. In other words, we're still in good shape. I think these polls that you mentioned earlier demonstrate that there's significant support among the voters in general in Germany, but there is growing doubt about the wisdom of this continued military support. There is a growing call for an early negotiation process. And quite frankly, I think that if I try to put myself in the shoes of the folks that I used to work with in the Kremlin, I would not rule out that as soon as they know who is going to be in the White House, and it's going to be very soon, I think they will be interested in starting a discussion, maybe not a public discussion, but a kind of a sounding out discussion with Washington about what might be, the parameters of an arrangement about Ukraine going forward. I don't think quite frankly, that the Kremlin is interested in negotiating, and I don't mean that, ironically or so, but I think it's a realistic assessment. I don't think they are interested in negotiating with Olaf Scholz or with Emmanuel Macron, because they believe that we're all simply vassals of the United States. At least that's the way many in Moscow think about this. So I think they will be interested in having a discussion at some point in some shape or form, and that hopefully could be then the basis of a more meaningful discussion, which will only lead to a good result if we don't stop our support. So, this is this one sentence: effective crisis diplomacy sometimes, very often, requires military support. If the military hardware is not there, your best diplomatic speech is not going to help much. You and I know that from our Bosnian experience 30 years ago.
And between us, we have like 40 years in government of people who said the way to success is diplomacy backed by force, right? Okay, I see a lot of hands up. Wow, look at that. Let's start right here with this gentleman. Please wait for the microphone and have a question mark at the end of your question. Yeah.
Hans-Jochen Schmidt, I worked for the Foreign Office a long time ago. You referred to the need of having leadership. I remember a very good speech delivered by Sikorsky at the Humboldt University, and that created a lot of questions here inside Germany. To oversimplify it, Scholz probably doesn't live up to that challenge. I'm questionable about what is the figures you referred to, polling. Let's say if you confront the German public with, for example, raising the budget of defense versus, and that is a hard question, particularly for the Social Democrats, social affairs. And that is a huge problem. Let's say we would have to go beyond the 2%. And up to now, most of the politicians, they criticize that they don't have enough access to the top leadership, to the 3. Let's say it's, you have 3 peoples, I call it the Troika, and the parliamentarians, they criticize that there's more or less no possibility to have any influence whatsoever to change the course. The cruise missiles is a very good example of. It's unbelievable that we have not been able to take a decision, and that is a lack of leadership. And the other thing, we committed a huge error, I think, in the 90s. And the other day, the Lithuanian ambassador said we were shocked about the Gorbimania in Germany. For us, Gorbachev is a criminal because he was responsible for the shooting of, roughly 40 people, I think, at that time. And I said, and you Germans, you adore him just because of reunification, but you didn't analyze correctly what was going on afterwards. No question, only a comment.
Well, I will note, though, that the polling actually showed support as a top 5 investment by the public as investing in defense. And that was above environmental issues as well, which was quite striking.
Okay. I'm going to go to Michael Kimmage all the way in the back because I know there will be a good question coming.
That's a lot of pressure.
I trust you here too. Don't worry, I'll get here. Yeah.
So I recognize how important it is to talk about the Bundeswehr and conventional threats to Germany, but I would say in my assessment, conventional threats to Germany from Russia are pretty remote, whereas the unconventional threats are immediate and enormous. I just have in mind the BND's press conference of, I think, roughly a week ago about all of the extreme stuff that Russia is doing, and I think it's going to get much worse in the short to medium term. So I just wanted to ask if that's a BND question, if that's a policing question in Germany, or if it's a Wehrmacht, a Bundeswehr question. If it's a Bundeswehr question in terms of dealing with the unconventional threats, because I think that's in a way the real and big issue of the moment.
Do you want to take that on?
Yeah, sure. Of course, you're right, Michael. The challenge that we're facing is, at this moment for us in Germany, only an indirect military one. We have a direct one in Ukraine for our Ukrainian friends. but the challenge that we're facing here is a major one, an unprecedented one in terms of the intensity of the disinformation campaigns. In fact, you can only call it extrajudicial killings. I mean, this Russian agent who killed in broad daylight an exiled, where was he from? Chechnya or Georgia?
Yeah, Chechen.
In broad daylight here in downtown Berlin. When that happened, the Russian government said, we don't know this perpetrator. After he was released in the course of this major hostage release that was co-organized with the United States and others, that particular gentleman was released and sent back to Moscow. And there is a photograph of him being welcomed by President Putin himself. And President Putin, apparently, if I remember correctly, spoke highly of him as, an agent who executed his mission. I mean, this is really extremely disturbing, because this is not in military terms, but this is in political terms, in ethical terms, the absolute maximum disrespect that you can pay to the sovereignty of a country with which you claim to desire to have normal relations.
The important point about this question you just asked is it reminds us of the sort of challenges we're facing today. And that's a little bit different from the challenges I know many of our countries faced in the post 9/11 era, where as you're countering insurgents or terrorists, you don't have to worry about warfare across a spectrum of high end, higher end in terms of nuclear challenges, and lower end as well, and even much more broadly, again, with some of the examples you highlight. In the United States, the term that has been applied has been known as integrated deterrence. And the theory behind that is when you're dealing with a state competitor, as we are talking about here, you need to use all of the tools at your disposal, those tools of statecraft across your government and also in concert with your allies and with your partners. So we need to buckle up and do that. And there have been a number of good examples over the last 2.5 years where that has been the case. Again, briefly mentioned the energy steps that Germany has taken and how notable that is. We've discussed a bit of the military steps as well, and sanctions in addition, but really needing to work across those governments, which is complicated and a little bit different, and we have to build the muscles to do that effectively.
And our Jim Mattis fellow is too modest to bring it up herself, so I'm going to hold up her new article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs entitled The Return of Total War, which is exactly on this subject and the need for governments to be able to deal with an incredibly broad spectrum of threats. Okay. So you had your hand up. You're not putting your hand up anymore. Oh, there it is. Yeah, coming back to you. Yeah.
My name is Yaşar Aydın from...
Please wait for the microphone.
My name is Yaşar Aydın from SWP. I'm working there especially on Turkey. My question is about what role can Germany play in the Ukraine war? So has Germany a power to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia? I'm asking because of the loss of reputation, for example, after the 7th October in the Arabic world. And where do you see Ukraine in 5 years? Within the NATO, or will Ukraine remain a neutral country? Thank you.
Okay, these were two questions.
You get to choose one.
All right, I'll choose the first, because the second one is about, one should never make predictions, especially not about the future.
Right.
But on the first question, what kind of role for Germany? I actually don't see a specific role if and when it comes to a process, a diplomatic process. I don't see a specific role for Germany. What I would imagine is that there would be probably a tendency by a number of countries, including, by the way, Turkey, to suggest that maybe a kind of a group of countries that would be willing to support a negotiating process could be created. We used to call that in the 90s and beyond a contact group. In this particular case, you would probably need a slightly larger contact group. I would imagine there would be a great interest by Turkey to be part of such a process. There would, of course, be the United States. What about China? The Chinese have shown direct interest in not staying away anymore from European conflicts. It's, by the way, this is historically new. The Chinese were not there in 1812, in Vienna, at the Congress in Vienna. They were not there in 1919. Well, actually, they were in Versailles in 1919, but only as observers. So now they have demonstrated that in the conflict between, Saudi Arabia and Iran, they've developed some active diplomacy, and they've presented their 10 points. Was it 10 points or 12 points on Ukraine? So they have adopted a position. They're interested, etc. So I think this is a major change from the practice of crisis diplomacy of the last century or two that we're looking at. And who else? What about India? Prime Minister Modi has demonstrated some degree of interest. I think if China plays a role here, the Indians will not want to be excluded, etc., etc. So you can play around with the countries that might be able to play a role and the countries that could play a role, and I'm sure there will be some kind of role for the European Union or some members of the European Union, but I don't see a specific German role. We're simply not strong enough and I don't think we want to do that. I think if we play a role, we want to play a role as part either of NATO or of the European Union.
Okay. Ms. Wallach. You always have to call on the
Christine
trustees.
You've talked about the political elites in the parties as not being maybe fully on board with the direction of further war. And you talked about the need for across government, joined up government action across a wide range of issues relating to success in carrying the war forward. So I want to take this up a level in Germany. I think the finance ministry, with its obsession with the Schwarze Null, the Constitutional Court, which has looked favorably on, let's say, fiscal conservatism. It's more than the party elites. It's actually a number of government structures that don't act in a joined-up way in this particular situation. How does one take this conversation in Germany up to a strategic level that, in fact, involves not just joined-up government, but also outside of government, including, for example, the Constitutional Court and other agents that need to be aligned to get the authorizing environment for a pro-Ukraine policy going forward?
I think that's yours again.
I can offer a perspective from the U.S., but I think she wants to answer.
Well,
We'll get an American.
very briefly, I have my personal opinion about this, which does not reflect the position of any of the parties in the current coalition or of the opposition. I believe that this extraordinary situation of a war in Europe would justify a kind of a suspension or semi-suspension of our wonderful Schuldenbremse. And the way you want to do that
limits the amount of.
There are various ways of doing it. Olaf Scholz himself showed the way when he presented this 100 billion package. I think there is no clause in our constitution or in the Schuldenbremse that would categorically deny the option of doing that again. If we conclude that the 100 billion wasn't good enough and that this war is likely to continue and require even more investment, both financial and military, etc., why not do it again and do another Sondervermögen if you don't want to put it into your normal budgetary procedure? So I would argue in favor of a kind of a creative management of these extremely dramatic and urgent needs, not to allow Ukraine to lose this war.
Did you want to? Okay. You had your hand up right there. Yes. Yes. Whoop. Yeah, don't bring the art down.
Thank you. Manfred Nitsch, professor here in political economy at the Freie Universität. And my question is to Mara Karlin. When you talk about society and the military, you mentioned recruitment, money, and history and knowledge. Viewed from the outside, what would you say are the issues which should come up now in our election campaign with regard to Zeitenwende? I live now in Potsdam, so is kind of the capital of the history of military history of Germany. What would you suggest? I live in Olaf's Wahlkreis, so what to tell him about what to say and what not to say with regard to Zeitenwende in this campaign.
Just to translate, he lives in the Chancellor's district. So he's going to have a particular influence on this if you get the right answer.
Look, I would not presume to have the answers to this, but I do think there's a point worth highlighting that we talked a little bit about. There is very substantial polling that says there's massive support across Germany for the military and for investing in the military. And that seems to be surprising to a lot of folks. And as tremendous as the 100 billion investment was, it filled gaps, and there are more gaps that continue to exist. So how can these two dynamics be matched up? That there seems to be a public who's interested, and there's also a really big need. So what does that look like? Does that look like helping folks understand here's exactly what the military is doing in your name, and here's why, and here's why you should demand excellence from that military? It seems to me there is something very intriguing there, because as much as we know there are kind of these 5 different elements highlighted to the Zeitenwende speech, folks aren't even really talking about the energy one. Again, a huge one, which is why I brought it up. It can't help but really be, I think, in many ways, a conversation about defense and what defense looks like, and everything Ukraine gets sort of looped into that. So the metrics by which people are going to assess it probably all spin in that arena.
Okay. Sir, right there. Yes, you. Yeah. You pointing at your head. Right. Wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Tom O'Donnell. I'm an American, but I've been here a long time. I work on energy and geopolitics. I kind of know each other. So I have a different working model, a little bit, of the picture that's painted, and I'd like a certain particular response from both people on this. I mean, I just want to say on the military thing, I'm not so surprised. I've spent time, for example, with the people on the Defense Committee from the AfD and the Bundestag, and they have high respect and regard for the military. It just is a different politics. So it's not only people who support Ukraine who have these feelings towards the military. That's another issue. But I worked for a long time in this Nord Stream thing, and I think I got some idea of where different political groupings in Germany stand. And I remember there's something that was declassified from Henry Kissinger. It was his sort of advice that he briefly wrote to Richard Nixon when Willy Brandt came up with this idea of Neue Ostpolitik. And he explained about the SPD, and well, they're with us. Don't worry, but they're going to get in over their heads. And I know you're worried about the left, but he made the point: it's not just the left; it's the conservative business class too, right? And he said, who see themselves as a country of the East. And my experience has, during the whole Nord Stream thing, it wasn't just the SPD and the Linke that have this support, which we understand and know about in America a lot, but a lot of people on the other side of the spectrum, especially business people, they'd start telling you immediately about the Hanseatic League. And theoretically, it's the same thing, right? Fondel through Handel. So my question to Wolfgang is, I think that for example, in the two or three of the three or so closest advisors to Mr. Scholz, Jens Plotner and Wolfgang Schmidt, you don't, anyway, have to say anything about them. But my impression de facto is that the theory they came to early in the war was that, A, this is really bad. It's not going to be good for Germany either way. The best thing is a Stillstand, a stalemate, which explains why they don't want to go too far in supporting. And it's going to maybe be bloody, but both sides will fight to a standstill, and that's reasonable. We can do something with that. The problem is when I say this to people in the diplomats, especially in the East, they say, yeah, what about Jake Sullivan, who comes and talks to these fellows? And why is it, and I mean, pragmatically, if you're a superpower, why would you say that we have to be careful what we do in support of Ukraine, what we get them, what is given to them?
Okay.
It's kind of long.
Yeah, kind of long.
I think no, I understand. Why do we have to be careful and smart about what we give Ukraine? Because President Putin has nuclear weapons and he has threatened their use multiple times over the last 2.5 years. That in no way suggests that we shouldn't support Ukraine and shouldn't support Ukraine robustly and among a very high number of allies and partners. But we've got to do that thoughtfully. We are playing a really complex game here, to put it lightly, when nuclear weapons are involved. And sometimes that decision-making may almost feel paralyzing, but it sure feels like a more responsible approach than ignoring the relevance of nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And let me just add that if there was a sense of, caution and responsibility and taking these kinds of threats seriously, that is, of course, that was even more present in the minds of those people you mentioned in the Bundeskanzleramt. And don't forget, Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan know they can deter Russia because the United States is a very strong nuclear power. For Olaf Scholz, there is a totally different kind of situation. First, we know we don't have our own deterrent. We are dependent on having the protection from our American and other allies. In the nuclear field, it's practically the United States alone. So I would personally say that even if I criticize Chancellor Scholz occasionally for being overly cautious, as many have said, I do respect a lot, as a former practicing diplomat myself, I respect a lot his conviction that his job is to make sure that Germany, after what happened in the 20th century, is not going to sort of stumble into a war, and that he would later on be blamed for, being responsible for something dreadful that happened on his watch. So I understand that he was maybe even more cautious than our friends in Washington, D.C. And I understand also that what you have all seen, that Olaf Scholz has carefully made certain over these 2.5 years that he follows more or less in the footsteps, in the shadow of the Biden administration. He wanted to have the closest possible relationship in order to make sure that he would not be out of touch with American thinking and maybe be left alone if Putin decided to take some action. So I want to just say I have a lot of respect for this approach of caution. Sometimes I would personally have preferred an attempt by us together, the West, to turn things around a little bit, and instead of reacting with great caution to these Russian threats, to maybe send a little message to the Kremlin saying that we have now watched you attack civilian targets in Odessa, in Kiev, in Kharkiv repeatedly. You should know that if you continue to do that, we will consider releasing, softening the limitations on the range of weapons that we have decided, and we will consider supporting Ukraine more. In other words, it's up to you in Moscow to decide whether you want more aggressive Ukrainian resistance to your attacks or whether you desist from attacking civilian targets, including the energy installations, etc., etc. Now, last word on this. Again, as a practicing diplomat, I know that if you draw this kind of a red line, you need to make sure that you can actually execute it. I think President Obama learned the hard way that this is not always easy. So this is risky, and I also have respect that because it's risky, that particular approach was not adopted, at least not so far.
Can I just note, these are really hard things, and how wonderful that our countries get to try to figure them out together.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place.